information to cover this week. So we'll start first with this. The remaining quizzes are now up, or I should say the last of the online quizzes. So I did notice that some of you have already taken quiz 13, but I think that the Thanksgiving turkey probably took over, and nobody's taking quiz 14 just yet. But quiz 15 is going to cover the material from this week. So just be aware that global warming is going to be prominently featured in that lecture. Anyway, we're going to finish lecture 28 today. That's going to be pretty easy. I think we only have like 10 slides left in that. And then really the bulk of today is going to be spent on lecture 29. That's going to be the global warming lecture. That lecture will take us into Wednesday. So we'll continue with lecture 29 on Wednesday. And then there's a shorter one, lecture 30, which is the final content lecture. It's the last one that really has any content. That's what we're going to finish up on Wednesday with. And then in week 16, the final week of instruction, I have a lecture that I'm giving on Monday that's going to be like a wrap-up sort of lecture. Just going to kind of pull everything together. I don't think there's really a whole lot of new content at all in that. And then we have our final exam on Wednesday of that week. So we're almost there, guys. We just have another week to get through, and then there's the entomology project as well. So we'll get to that today in lab. We'll really get a good assessment of how far along you are with that collection, and it's critical because today is our only lab day. We won't be in lab on Wednesday of this week. Basically, this is to replace our lab that we had on the research cruise. So the research cruise is taking the place of Wednesday, or it did. And then next week, same thing. We will have a lab on Monday. It'll be a documentary that we will be watching on Monday of next week. And then on Wednesday, I'm just going to have an open lab period. There's no scheduled lab that day because after your final exam, hopefully some of you will already have turned in your entomology project. If not, though, I will have the lab open that Wednesday so that you can continue to work on your project and then turn it in at the end of that day or at the latest Thursday of next week. So Thursday is the last day that I will accept the entomology project in whatever state it's in. So let's keep that in mind. Now, regarding the papers, I got papers back from most of you. Most of you turned those papers in on time. For those of you that did not turn in your paper evaluations, I'm urging you to please consider doing that because there are some students in the class that are relying on that. And I can't send back the evaluated papers to the authors if they haven't been evaluated. So this is not just a grade for you, it's also an opportunity for your peers to rewrite their papers. So I would urge you to please send that in. Turning it in late is better than nothing, but sooner than later is better than nothing because we also want to give people enough time to rewrite their papers. Okay, so by this afternoon, I will be sending your papers back to you, and hopefully, and if you only receive one, it's because I'm still waiting on your second evaluation, and I will send it to you as soon as I receive it. Any questions on that? Okay, so those are the bigger ticket items. We have 3 quizzes. We have an entomology project, and we have the final writing assignments. And so once we get past all of those and the final exam, then you're done. So I know this class has been a lot, right? This has been a lot of hard work. But I also hope that you find this class to be fun and rewarding too. And I would love it if I could get some feedback at the end of this semester, not just on what the things that you thought needed to be changed. That would be helpful to know, but also the things that you enjoyed, so that I know that I keep those things or emphasize them in future semesters for other students. So the good and the bad and the ugly. I'm interested in knowing all of that stuff. Okay, so this is the to-do list. Any questions on what we're doing this week? that's the idea. If I can get them out to you by today, I would prefer that you have it turned in by this Friday. And I know that doesn't seem like it's a lot of time, but honestly, I would rather you be done with it before the weekend, because I would rather you be focusing on other things on the weekend. The worst thing would be to postpone it to Sunday, and now you're writing your paper on the weekend when you should be studying for other things. So I want to get it done and get it turned around. Any other questions? Thanks for the question. I think that's important. Okay, we're not going to do this one just yet. We are going to finish this. And just to reiterate where it is that we left off. Okay, this is the slide before we left off. We were talking about water resources. This is the lecture where we are addressing the difference between how organisms utilize resources in order to get them through their life versus how humans utilize resources, and how we've come to create whole new streams of resources that we seem to think that we require. But in fact, what we really require for life is just a limited number of things that is very similar to what other organisms need. And we were in the section here talking about water and water use. And we were noting that we don't use water resources, I guess, in correlation with how they are provided to us very well. We don't do that very well. Case in point, this is the hillside that is behind my house, up in the hillside behind where I live. It's the whole area of La Habra Heights and Hacienda Heights, and also Roland Heights, so that whole area there. Anyway, this is what the hillside pretty much looked like in the 1800s, all the way through to the early 1900s. It was basically a bunch of local Southern California trees and grassland, very typical California chaparral with walnut trees, sycamores, coastal live oak, and also native grasses. And the reason why these are the plants that are most prominent here in Southern California, in our hillsides, is because they are the ones that over millions of years have evolved to thrive on the amount of rainfall that normally hits us here in Southern California, which is not a lot. In spite of this really cool storm that's coming this weekend, we don't get a whole lot of rain. We get about 13 to 14 inches, and the ecosystem here in Southern California has to thrive on that amount of water. So in the days of the Mexican land grant, where land was simply essentially deeded to certain individuals, this area, which is now basically the border between North Orange County and LA County, was essentially deeded to about a dozen different families. One in particular was the Rowland family and the Workman families. Those were two families. And they were cattle ranchers. And so you can imagine what it would be like having to cattle ranch on land like this. There's a lot of grasses that your cattle can eat, but the grasses are only prominent at certain times in the year. So it made sense, given that there was only a certain amount of rainfall in this area, that you're only going to raise a certain number of head of cattle. So you wouldn't put 10,000 cattle on a space this big, because you would quickly strip out the resources, just like we learned in Tragedy of the Commons. So it made sense that the families that were managing this area for cattle ranching had to be very good at managing the number of head of cattle they have with the size of the land that they have and time it with the seasons, because there was no other way to do this. So then, and they were very successful at this from about 1890s until maybe 1930, right before World War II. Now, one of the things that is a common theme for upstarts and also immigrants and people that have come to work the land in this country is that you try and work as hard as you can so that your children will have a better life. That's a theme no matter where you came from. And so what it means is that the Workman family, the Rowland family, and all these other families that have these assets, their children oftentimes did not take over the family business. In fact, they were able to be successful enough in their life that their children went to college. And being that their children go to college, it means now they're becoming working class professionals. Cattle ranching kind of changes. So instead of it being a regional endeavor where you basically just ranch locally and sell locally, we started inventing industrial agriculture and industrial farm production and stuff, and that's a whole nother mess. But the point is that there was de-emphasis in this sort of cattle ranching. So you can imagine the children in the 1940s that are now working class professionals who inherit this land. What are they going to do with it? Because they're not cattle ranching anymore. Well, what do you think is the likely scenario here? So it's like post-World War II.
They might sell it.
Yeah, you sell it, right? Sell it to who? Who's going to buy a big open plot of land that, doesn't do anything really for you? You'd sell it to developers. And at this time, post-World War II, there's a boom in the economy. In fact, there is a big push to have as many babies as you can to jumpstart this economy. And this is where the baby boomers essentially came from, is post-World War II. And so houses were being built all across the nation. But the resources that are required to do that, oftentimes there's less forethought in how you're going to deal with that. So here we have a family that is working this land in the 1890s, knowing that they only have 13 to 14 inches of rain, and therefore have to essentially utilize the land with that in mind. So here, we're going to keep some of the land though. We'll keep some of it. So this is what it ends up looking like. So over here now, we have this development, which is adjacent to native, or essentially local landscape. And now we're going to transition. This made a crap ton of money. Each one of these is a house that gets sold on a much smaller plot, and it has a value that you can look up on Zillow or whatever the equivalent of Zillow was back in the 1950s. And then you jump to maybe the 1980s, and we are now one generation later, and this land over here is still owned by a family. Of course, they are now so disconnected from how the land gets used that they're going to sell the rest of it. So I want you to think about what has transpired in the last 100 years of the use of this land. Prior to that, with 13 to 14 inches of rainwater hitting the ground and growing whatever grows in Southern California with that amount of water resources, versus the whole idea that if the Rowland family had wanted to, instead of having 400 head of cattle, they wanted to have 4,000 head of cattle. Well, a developer's idea would be, well, we're just going to take a hose and we're going to water the ground out there to essentially pretend that there's more than 13 to 14 inches of rain. We're going to have it be 25 inches of rain, the equivalent of. Well, they didn't have water infrastructures to even consider doing that. And yet here, 100 years later, that is precisely what we did. None of the water that is being used by any of these houses is coming from that area. None of it is coming from within a radius of 100 miles of these houses. It's being essentially piped in from places where water resources are more plentiful to essentially water a Southern California Mediterranean chaparral. So that's crazy. What's more is not only are we piping the water in, But the 13 to 14 inches of rain that actually does fall, we are getting rid of as fast as we can. Every one of these houses here, and all the development, the chances of water actually hitting a landscape or hitting a hardscape area where you have asphalt or concrete or roofs is pretty good. And all of these hard surfaces are designed to get rid of the water as quickly as possible. We want it to be out in the ocean in less than 24 hours. It's amazing how we've essentially engineered this landscape. It's insane, actually, how we've engineered that landscape. Meanwhile, we are using water here. It's just coming from hundreds of miles away through pipelines, so that there are, hoses on either side of each one of these houses. There's 3.5 bathrooms. There's, sinks to go with all of that. There is a lot of water being used in every single one of these places. And oh, by the way, all of the beautification, all the greenery that you see, these are all plants that are not from Southern California. We've taken the grasses and the trees that have evolved to live on 13 to 14 inches of rainwater, and we replace them with plants from other parts of the world where water resources are more plentiful, and therefore they've evolved to require that. So when, there's many places we can take this conversation, but this is an artificial, essentially an artificial water black hole. And what's more is that as the water is being used in each one of these little plots, it gets used and then sent down a drain, which takes you to a sewer system, which attempts to clean it, cleans out all of the human waste, and then pumps the remainder of that back out into the ocean. So now that's changing. We're getting better at doing that. We are reclaiming a lot of that water, but not fast enough to make up for the fact that we are depleting it everywhere else. So remember, water cycles. The whole idea that it's cycling through, and it's replaceable if you give it enough time to do that. But we're utilizing it at a rate that's faster than its cycling nature. So that's a problem. Okay, so I'm going to make that point here. Of where does your water come from here in Southern California? A small amount of it is pumped from the ground, and actually we're hoping that amount will increase as our local municipalities and water districts begin to replenish it into the ground, and that's something that the Orange County Sanitation District is currently working on. For the last 10 years now, they've had this really great program where water is cleaned that comes to them from the sewer systems, and it goes through this system called a groundwater recharge system. And so I think it's somewhere near Fountain Valley. It's going into the ground, and also in Anaheim. And then they're going to withdraw it elsewhere, and that water has to actually percolate through tons and tons of rock. So that adds a cleaning element to it. So that's good. But that's a small percentage right now of the water you consume is withdrawn from the ground. Most of it comes from faraway locations. The Sierra Nevada is one of them. The Colorado River, and for those that live in LA County, some of it for the city of Los Angeles is still coming from the central southern Sierras. So when I say the Sierra Nevadas, I'm talking about like the northern Sierra Nevadas. And that's far away. And all of that water is essentially running down conduits and in pipes to provide water resources for cities that don't typically have water resources available to them. San Diego is the end of the line. That's where there's 3 million people, but there's 10 million people in Los Angeles, and there's 4 million people in Phoenix right now. Phoenix is a desert. Los Angeles is close to a desert. It's like a chaparral. San Diego's basically a desert. And Salt Lake City is, kind of close to that as well. So the Colorado River in particular, that's just one of the water sources, is providing resources to more people than it actually, well, I should say, it's allocated to more people than it actually can provide. That's one of the weirdest things about our water rights laws here in California. I could do an entire lecture just on water rights laws in California. We're not going to do that. Unfortunately, we don't have the time for that. But it's insane the way the water rights laws work in California, but in the West in particular. The Colorado River has been divided up for next year, for 2023. And the amount of water that it's supposed to provide is going to be a fraction of what the river actually has. So how do you do that? How do you allocate water that doesn't exist? Well, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you, but that's precisely how we treat the Colorado River right now. So there's this huge burden on the ecology of that river, and by the way, it no longer flows into Mexico. It used to flow into Mexico. It used to be a water resource for Mexico. It's no longer a water resource for Mexico. So, in Southern California, here is by proportion where you get your water. So more than half of it is coming from either the Bay Area Delta, which is Northern California, or the Colorado River, one of these two. 5% right now, this number is shrinking. 5% is coming from the Owens Valley. That's the part that's basically the central east coast of California. And it's coming down the LA Aqueduct. This is a whole story unto itself of how it is that the city of Los Angeles acquired its water through all of the back deals and illegal actions that happened about 100 years ago. And only about a quarter of that water, this is up from about 25% when I've given this lecture 3 or 4 years ago, so this number is actually increasing, is locally sourced. Because now we're doing a better job of reclaiming the water, but again, still more than half of what is used is not coming from local areas. So only 4% is from that groundwater recharge. When I first started giving this lecture, the goal was to get 1% of it. Now we're at 4%, but still that number needs to be much higher than that. So here is the reality of things. Here's Southern California. And you'll notice that Southern California is essentially a desert. There are parts of Southern California that are actual deserts, like the northern expanse of the Sonora Desert, which is extending up from Baja. But even the areas that are up here, which are desert-like, it's kind of like Mediterranean chaparral, the border between that and an actual desert. So there's not a lot of water that we have here. And these are the aqueduct trunks that carry water to us here in Southern California. So there's the California Water Project, bringing it from Northern California. Here's the LA Aqueduct, this comes from up there, and the Colorado River with the Colorado River Aqueduct. And desalination plants, I'm just going to mention real quickly here, these are operations along the coastline that bring in seawater and use it to, they run it through reverse osmosis and other processes to essentially extract fresh water. And that process works, I mean, technically we have the ability to do that. That's being done all around the world right now. But there's only one desal plant that's operating right now in the southern half of in all of California, and it's right down here in Encinitas. So the Poseidon desal plant is operating. You're like, why wouldn't they do that, right? Why wouldn't we do more of that? That seems like we have this giant ocean out here. It is hugely expensive to do that. And what's more is, not only is it very expensive to do, but all of these other ways of getting water to you are artificially cheap. So when somebody says, you know, I'm willing to pay, you know, $50 on my monthly water bill, I am not willing to pay $500 a month for that same amount of water. We have been lulled into this assumption that water is cheap. It's not. It's only artificially so because of our infrastructure, and we waste it because of that. So just to give you an idea, when you get water from the California Water Project, if you live up in the Bay Area Delta, there are people up there who have been grandfathered into paying $5 an acre foot. What is an acre foot? Well, an acre is a certain amount of land, and if you flood it with 1 foot of water, that volume of water is an acre foot. $5 an acre foot. That's pretty much what some of the old farmers who were essentially involved in writing the water rights laws of 150 years ago. So then, if you come down here to certain parts of Southern California, the residents there are paying somewhere around, essentially like between $100 and $150 an acre foot. And that's divided up among all of the houses that would use that, okay? Desalination is about $2,000 an acre foot. So it's an order of magnitude more expensive to do that. And you might ask, well, if it's that expensive, why did the San Diego folks even decide to do it in Encinitas? What drove them to do it, but Huntington Beach won't do it, El Segundo won't do it, and Morro Bay won't do it? Well, it has to do with the fact that the water rights laws that we have are tiered based on priority of who got it in the past. So if you were fortunate enough to be descendant of somebody who was on that water rights laws from 1860, you're guaranteed #1 right to water. And they're going to give you however much water you used last year. So you want to, and if you're only paying $5 an acre foot, it is in your best interest to waste as much as you can. Because wasting water guarantees that you will have that amount next year. It's insane how we do that. Anyway, guess who's on the bottom of the priority list? San Diego. San Diego's on the bottom of the priority list. They are last in line to get the water, which means all the over-allocated Colorado River water, they're the ones who basically are like, sorry, we're out of water, you don't get your water because you're not, on the top of the list. So San Diego has realized that they have this big city down here, and it's growing. They need reliable access to water, and they can't rely on the Colorado River anymore. That's why they're willing to spend $2,000 an acre foot for water. It's more expensive, but it's also a sure thing that they're going to get it tomorrow. And it also requires huge amount of engineering ability and everything else. Taking salt out of water, it turns out, is really challenging. It's very, very difficult. Okay. So, given the, and I've only touched the surface, by the way, on the politics of water and all of that here in California. Again, this is the amount that we normally get in Southern California. We have to reconcile that against some of the ways that we use water. Whether it's growing Bermuda grass on golf courses, which, by the way, requires 40 to 60 inches of water, corn, 22 to 25, or lettuce. Lettuce is something that we grow in the Central Valley of California. 50 to 100 inches of rain, essentially, is what would be required to do that if you made nature do it for you. So these things don't agree with the fact that not only do we get far less water than we utilize for our agriculture in California, but that numbers go, but that the drought situation we are currently in means that 13 to 14 inch average, in the last 5 years, we've had less than that. So, again, we're really excited about this storm coming this weekend, but again, our experience is often very short term. And when it rains, we go, oh, we must not have a problem. But over the entire year, that rainstorm is only going to help a little bit. So we need more of them. And that's only to get us through this year. Okay, so we need better water rights laws. They're stupid. They are idiotic, and it's time to get rid of the 1860s laws that are on the book. We don't have 500 million people anymore. We have 8 billion people. Okay, realistic conservation. We need better water reclamation. So right now it's it's approaching 50% of the water that goes to Orange County Sanitation District is actually going to groundwater recharging. That's incredible. It used to be way lower than that. It needs to be closer to 100% for every sanitation district, not just Orange County's. We need better infrastructure. We have these big open concrete lined channels that carry our water around through places where it's 115 degrees in the summer. We lose a huge amount of water just to evaporation. But that costs money, right? To redo those pipes. Billions of dollars. Billions. But we need that if we're going, and we need to pay the billions now so that we don't have to pay the hundreds of billions 10 years from now. Because it's only going to get worse. We need better water education. People need to know where their water comes from. And again, it's the whole idea that when you turn the tap on, regardless of whether we're in a drought or not, water just comes out. So we don't perceive it as a problem. So we need better water education and a realistic cost structure. I'm not saying that water should be 10 times more expensive, which by the way it is in San Diego. But it needs to be realistic. People don't waste gasoline because it costs money. But water is something you absolutely need to survive, and we pay less for the water than we do for milk or Coca-Cola or gasoline. So if it were different, maybe society would think differently about it. Anyway, this is Lake Piru, where I do a lot of my environmental consulting work, and we're going to be diving out there this weekend. So in spite of this picture, it's going to be a very different weekend up at Lake Piru, because I think on Friday the expectation is there will be more than 1 inch of rain falling in that one day. So it's going to be like standing under a waterfall for the entire day. For those that are topside, I'm going to be underwater, so I won't notice it. Anyway, the point being that the days of this have to go away. This old guy is thinking in an old way and is essentially using Sierra Nevada snowpack water to clean off the asphalt in front of his store. He probably could take a lesson from this guy right here. The goal is to clean the area in front of the store. There are other ways to do it other than using Sierra Nevada snowpack water. Thinking differently about how we landscape also. This is obviously not a house in Southern California. This is a house in another part of the country which has far more water resources, where it's like 3 times more water than we have. I still think that it's an unnecessary holdover to be growing Bermuda grass in your front yard, but it's a different place. So where does commercial grass come from? Because nobody grows, this grass does not grow natively all over the United States. It comes from a particular place, and it's important to know that. So it comes from Oregon. You guys know where Oregon is? Okay, for those of you that are geographically challenged, there's Oregon up there. And we're down here. Okay? They get 43 inches a year. That's their rainfall. So obviously it's like 3.5 times, or it's about 3 times our water resources. And so do you think they water the grass up there? No, they don't water the grass because the grass has evolved to require 43 inches a year. So, pretty cool. To grow commercial grass down here in Southern California, we essentially trick the grass into thinking it's still in Oregon. That's a weird way of thinking about it, right? Another way to think of it is, I'm in charge. This is my lawn. I'm going to go buy grass regardless of where it comes from. This is where I want it, and I'm going to water it to get it to grow. I'm in charge. The reality is it's the exact opposite. So there's been a war for the last 250 million years in North America between trees and grass. There are times when trees win, and it's mostly forested. There are other times when the grass is winning, and grass is overtaking areas. It's, the whole succession business, right, of going back and forth between the two. And guess what? The grasses have won. The grasses have won because they have figured out, without thinking about it, how to get another species to grow them in places where they haven't evolved to grow. Yeah, isn't that weird? You are not in charge. The grass is in charge. They have figured out how to get a thinking human to grow it here and to manicure it and to get rid of all other species that might compete with it. It's incredible, right? Yeah. Very interesting how that's worked out. Anyway, so how do you get the grass to think it's still living in Oregon? You have to water it the equivalent of the water resources that are available in Oregon. So we water the heck out of it.
Professor?
Yeah?
What could be a good solution for that?
I'm glad you asked. That's a really good, I'm sure you're all thinking this. What is the solution for this, right? It's a good question. That's a very good question. Well, we have to think about where we are, what we have available to us, and what we regard as actual beauty. You know, growing grass has always been seen as something that is an aristocrat's hobby. The goal, I guess the history behind this is it comes from Old World France, where people who essentially owned the estates, who were the landowners, as a way to show just how filthy wealthy they were, they literally grew grass in the front of their home for no other purpose than for aesthetics. Here in the New World, in America, where we brought over our European ideals, it was a sign of that same wealth. Even if you weren't as wealthy, you wanted to show that you kind of were that wealthy. So I may not be able to grow 5 acres of grass, but I've got this little patch in front of my house. It'll be my symbol of aesthetics. And that's why we do it. We don't have to do that. And there's a lot of those things. Actually, if you think back to the 1800s to the 1950s, that 100-year span, there were things in all kinds of cultures around the world that were seen as only what rich people did, or only what the aristocracy did. And now that we have a growing middle class from 1950 to 2022, if you are the children of people from that time, or the grandchildren of people who came from that time, a show of wealth is to essentially live or consume in a way that aristocracy did 100 years ago. It is the reason why we grow green grass in our front yards, or eat shark fin soup, or do any of these other things that essentially used to be only resigned to rich people. So so here's the solutions. These are beautiful flowers up here. I think that you might all agree. It's all about colors and beauty. And this is the reality, is that Southern California doesn't get the rainfall that Oregon gets. We get less than 1/3 of that. And so we need to start looking locally to what is beautiful and what can survive on the amount of rain that we get. So, and just to make that point, you know, we use water because it is so artificially cheap. We use it for entertainment value, essentially. And the water that could be used to support 3/4 of the world's water needs, and I mean that of people, like, you know, to actually drink with and to cook with and to bathe with. That's security, is having water. So we pour that amount on the world's golf courses every single year. And golf, one could argue, is a sport that is only enjoyed by middle class and upper class people. So that's the unfortunate reality there. This is Palm Springs, where there basically are no water resources. It's all basically brought in from distant locations, mostly the Colorado River. And grass in a desert is insane. It just is. Here is a very realistic desert front yard. This is actually my grandfather's house that he used to live in Arizona. And in Arizona, you know, just outside of Phoenix, everybody accepts that you live in a desert. And so it's nuts to pour water on the ground in a desert, and so we need to be thinking along these lines as well. So this is one thing that you can do, is to xeriscape. Xeriscape is the term that you're looking for. Xeriscaping is essentially landscaping using plants that are native to the region, and xeriscaping in Southern California means using California native plants. So for example, purple threon, this is a grass that essentially, I mean, most people think about Mexican feathergrass, which is not native to the area in spite of the name. Replacing that with purple threon, which is a Southern California native grass. We have native plantains. We have coastal dune strawberries. We have buckwheat and bladderpod, and what's the other one over here? Coyote brush and penstemon, and all of these other really cool local plants that you'll probably learn about in Biology 214 when you take that class. But these essentially require a fraction of the amount of water, and they are beautiful. They are absolutely gorgeous. This particular yard right here in the middle has a bioswale, which means any water that falls on the house essentially gets funneled into gutters that then bring them into catchments, which then send them through French drains and fill this area right here. So in a big rainstorm, the water actually fills in there and then it goes away. So none of the water that hits this property are running off into the street. It all goes straight into the ground. It's been designed that way. And I know that because that's my front yard. Yeah, that's my front yard. And here's what my front yard looked like last weekend. So we've got buckwheat everywhere. We have, these are Lazy Susans. We just put in our we call them Manzi. It's our manzanita tree. So it's now essentially going to shade the front of the area. And yeah, there is a species of native Southern California desert grape. So this is our desert grapes. I've made wine with it. Not good wine, but I've made some wine. But we make lots of jam, we make lots of grape must, syrups, all kinds of really cool things from our native grapes. And guess what? It also, here's the other amazing thing, is that being native plants, you're not just xeriscaping, you're literally creating habitat, Southern California native habitat. And it attracts all kinds of local species, right? This is the Allen's hummingbird on our bladder pot in our front yard. And these are hair streaks. You might have caught one in your collection. But it's living on our baby blue eyes. And, and the newest one. So these are stinky monkey flowers here, which native species of insects absolutely love. So yeah, we actually have native species of insects growing in our front yard as well. So this is one way to deal with water use, is to xeriscape. To water my entire front yard takes a little more than 1 gallon of water. And it happens every third day. So every 3 days. And by the way, the typical flush, even the low flow toilets, use more than that every time you flush the toilet. So for less than a toilet flush, every 3 days, once every 3 days, my entire front yard gets all the water it needs. And it's beautiful, one could argue. I don't know, I think it is. Another way to go, gray water recovery. So just like the Orange County Sanitation District is doing what they can to reclaim water and put it into the ground for groundwater recharging, other businesses and homes can now take this upon themselves to do it as well. This is my little vertebrate. Long before she was an adult, this was when she was 9 years old, and this is actually in San Luis Obispo behind the Apple Farm restaurant. The Apple Farm restaurant is right off the 101. If you guys are heading up to see the elephant seals in San Simeon in the spring, you should stop at this restaurant. Behind the restaurant, they have catchment vats that essentially recover what's called gray water. And gray water recovery is essentially using sink water and anything that goes down a sink or from the kitchen or anything. What does not go in here is toilet water. So that's actually referred to as black water, and that goes to the sanitation district. But everything else doesn't need to go to the sanitation district. This water, which obviously you're not going to drink because people have washed their hands in it and dishes have been washed, and there might even be some detergent in it. And the detergents, as long as you use biodegradable detergents that are, earth-friendly, you can take that water and water the apple farm behind the restaurant. They actually grow their apples using reclaimed gray water. Because guess what? The apple trees don't care if it's Sierra Nevada snowpack. They just care about it being water molecules, right? You don't want to poison your plants, though, so maybe you should use detergents that won't kill plants. Yeah?
Is there any concern with that, with any of the chemical buildup or anything?
Good question. So, is there concern with chemical buildup in here? Yes, that there is a concern, which is why this restaurant and those people who do gray water reclamation don't use toxic detergents in their clothes washing machines or in their washing machines or down their sinks. You basically rely on soaps and detergents that are biodegradable, number one, and that are non-toxic biodegradable. And you can, that's easy to look up and to find those resources, because as long as they are safe for plants, you can pour them on in your backyard. And so that's another thing that we do. One thing is, and by the way, I have a video that is up on Canvas right now, which shows you kind of how to do this yourself. Basically, to replumb your entire house to reclaim all of the gray water, it costs a lot of money, because if you are building a new house, that's one thing, then you can actually build it from the ground up to do that. But most people who move into a house that's already built, or into an apartment, for example, you don't have that option. But there are cheap things you can do. So your washing machine and your dishwasher both have pumps in them. And you may have known this, you hear it working, it's like washing your stuff. And then you hear for about 5 minutes this sound. What it's doing is it's pumping the water into your sewer system. So there's a little Y-shaped, upside down pipe that then dumps the water and then it goes out into your sewer system. It has that pump already on it. You just connect up to that and send the water out into your backyard, and that's how you water your strawberries or your urban farm growing stuff, which is what we do. So, yeah.
When I was in Mexico, the house that we were living had the water underneath our house.
Uh-huh.
So what we used to do is that the washer, if we didn't have a dryer, when it was like the softener cycle, we collect the water and use it for the next.
Perfect. Yeah.
And then we dry everything on the roof.
And you might as well, right? Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, it's using nature to do what you're trying to achieve instead of engineering something that doesn't take nature into account. Yeah, that's a great solution. Yeah.
My mom will get mad if we like missed it.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, because it's precious stuff, right? You don't want to waste that. Yeah, absolutely. So this is another step that we've taken in our house. As I was mentioning before, we have a gutter system, but all of that goes into water catchments that hold it for a time. And then it goes from there into either the bioswale if we need to, like this rainstorm is going to drop way more water than any of these barrels can hold. So we just open them all up and they literally drain into the bioswale, and then we collect what falls in the next couple of days. But this is on the back of my house here, this is on the side in the front yard. I mean, whiskey barrels. These are all whiskey barrels that are serving as water catchments. And I have a little drain down there at the bottom, so I can hook up a hose and literally we can take care of, this is actually an old picture. We have purple 3-on grasses growing right here in the front of our house. So obviously we don't intend to drink this water, but why pour Sierra Nevada snowpack all over the ground when we can use rainwater that we collected last month, right? It's perfect. And as long as you have a screen over it so that you don't get mosquitoes, because that is another issue, then you're fine. Even Vector Control here in Orange County will provide stuff for you if you need that. So we do have 1/2 barrel in the front, which serves as like a little pond. And so Vector Control comes by every month or two to make sure that our mosquito fish are fat and healthy. And as long as we have mosquito, if we don't have any more mosquito fish, they throw a few more fish in there for us so we don't have mosquitoes. Anyway, this is a cool recovery system for dealing with two things. Number one, rainwater, and number two, gray water that you can reutilize from your showers, your sinks, your washing machine, and your clothes washing machines, your dishwasher and your clothes washer. What do you think? Is this something that you guys would be interested in trying, perhaps? Yeah. Okay. Other countries do this too, as a matter of course. If you're ever fortunate enough to go to Japan, very rarely will you ever see sink water going directly down the drain. Oftentimes the sink is attached to the back of the toilet. When you wash your hands, the water goes to fill the back of the toilet, right? I mean, if you're gonna pee or poo in it, you're not gonna use it for cooking purposes or whatever. It's fine to use hand washing water for that too, right? So at least they get a second use out of it. Anyway, moving on. So that's water. I spend a lot of time on water just because we're in Southern California, it's a big deal. Food preparation, again, this could be an entire lecture unto itself. We're just going to spend 4 or 5 slides on this. Obviously, with a growing population, because we mentioned that as one of the environmental issues, is feeding more mouths, right? So farming has its ups and downs, but whether it's good or bad and how you do it, it is necessary, right? We need to farm because the last thing that hunter-gatherers, I know there's a big move right now for people, I'm gonna go and hunt my own food or get my own mushrooms, or that's great. On a one-off basis, that's fine. But the last thing we want is 8 billion humans becoming hunter-gatherers again. That would be one sure way to completely destroy nature. So, farming has to be some sort of a solution. If we're going to save nature, we need to actually do some farming. But traditional farming, as it is currently practiced, industrial agriculture, is not designed around environmental sustainability. Not yet. It's getting better, but like fractions. So, the way that we do it in the United States, which really came out of the 1950s, this is a post-World War II thing, it emphasizes monocultures. It emphasizes the growing of a single crop over very large areas, and oftentimes it's not because the farmers chose to do that. It's because that is what the market demands. And that is one of the biggest changes that has occurred in the United States from the early days of, I don't know, the best way I can think of it is if you've ever seen old Bugs Bunny cartoons or old Warner Brother cartoons from the 1930s and the 1940s. So that's where Bugs Bunny came from, is from the 1930s, like that sort of era. If you watch those cartoons, not only are they incredibly funny and wouldn't pass muster today because they are a little bit violent, but back then that's what we had. I wasn't born back then, but still, I grew up on Bugs Bunny cartoons. They often show farm scenes, right? Like they've got the rooster guy that comes out and the cat, and they're all living on a farm. Back then, the American farm was a very different place from post-1950s industrial farming, because there was a variety of things grown on thousands of farms, like little home family farms that would sell locally. That's how the U.S. economy was built for agriculture back then. What ended up happening is distribution became a big deal. We wanted now, instead of just selling to within a 30-mile radius of my home, I want to be able to sell in California. I want to be able to sell to people in New York. So I'm going to create this layer of bureaucracy above it, which essentially now says, look, instead of the farmer selling directly to the store, I'm going to step in and you're going to sell it to me as the middleman, and I'm going to now distribute it to all of the supermarkets around the world, or even in other countries. The problem is that when consumer demand says, like, okay, I want Cocoa Puffs and Chef Boyardee, ravioli, and all of these other things that essentially reshapes the demand, and now the middleman goes to the farmer and goes, what are you selling? You go, oh, I've got some collard greens, I've got some chard over here, I've got some corn, I've got some rice, I've got 25 different things that I'm growing. And they're like, okay, well that's great, but I'm only going to buy your corn. You don't want the other things? No, I only want the corn. Okay, well here's how much the corn is. Well, I tell you what, I'm not willing to pay that price. I'm going to pay this amount, and if you don't want to sell it to me for that, I'm going to go and buy it from the other 100 farmers around you for that price. They've all agreed to it. So it took the power out of the hands of the farmers, really. And this is the reason why we grow monocultures of corn, because that's all they can sell. Nobody wants to buy anything else on an industrial scale. So if you're going to grow a monoculture because of this weird demand pressure, it means that you're going to increase the susceptibility of diseases. You've now grown things close to each other with no diversity or biodiversity or negative feedback loops or any of that. It essentially invites disease. It invites pests. And all of that stuff needs to be controlled if you want to maintain a monoculture. Pesticides, heavy use of fertilizers. It is essentially trying to stave off tragedy of the commons. That's really what it comes down to. So these are the big four that are grown in the United States. And much of the corn growth doesn't even go to supporting humans directly. It goes towards supporting humans indirectly, and also ends up screwing up international economies too when we start giving free grains around the world, because we're literally overgrowing our corn. We're growing so much more corn than is necessary. But that's what the market has demanded. Okay, as far as nutrition goes, in the 1970s and 80s, there really was this push. It started actually before that, to enhance the food supply so that we could feed more people. And there were mixed results with this, right? Some good, some not so good. And it was referred to as the Green Revolution. Now, in spite of what that might sound like, Green Revolution might sound like it was some environmental thing. No, it actually had to do with an attempt to increase the food production in the United States by going through this scientific process of selecting strains of plants that could withstand low water conditions or crowding or all of these other things. And it was actually quite successful. We increased the food stock in the United States in the 50s and 60s by doing this. And it has completely changed starting in about the mid-1990s. In the mid-1990s, we also added genetic engineering to this, where we actually could get it, and we're so much better at this today than we were even in the mid-1990s, at manipulating species at the gene level to essentially build in productivity, increased productivity, resistance, resistant plants, so resistant to other things that would normally kill off plants. The one thing though that, whether it's the Green Revolution or genetic engineering, you still are working with living organisms. And in so doing, you can never get around the input of water and nutrients. You still need phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon and water. You need these things to grow them. So we have the genetic capacity to do this now, but it still requires huge amounts of resources. Now I do want to just briefly mention, I think that you will probably discuss this in greater detail in 214, but genetically modified organisms, GMOs, it's gotten a lot of press recently, and so the question is, the assumption is that the environmental movement as a whole is against this, but that's actually not necessarily the case. Most thinking scientists and environmentalists that have science backgrounds are cautiously in support of genetically modified organisms for a couple of reasons. And there are negative stereotypes associated with it that we as scientists need to be able to kind of remove ourselves from that so that we can really think about this in terms of the science of it. Number one, nutrition. Turns out that genetically modified organisms are no less nutritious than things that are grown through conventional agriculture. So that's, now, that having said that, the nutritious value of food grown today, whether it's conventional or genetically modified, it tends to be a little bit lower than what it was in the 1950s. And that's because the emphasis is always on mass production, whether it's GMOs or non-GMOs. The mass production part of that is ultimately what drives the reduction in nutrients. A tree is gonna, and we know there's trade-off rules, right? You have a certain finite amount of energy. You can produce 10 apples or 100 apples. We are going for the 100 apples, but each apple has a tenth the value of a single apple grown more slowly. So you can't get around that, right? You're going to essentially redistribute the nutrients to more apples. It means they have less nutrients in them. And it's, again, it has to do with the emphasis on mass production. So GMOs are not less nutritious than any other things sold on the market unless you're growing them at home yourself. That's the way to get out of that, that vicious cycle. GMOs as being dangerous is also, the evidence that has borne out has basically said, no, there's no danger to using GMOs. They do not change or alter your DNA, right? We don't, that doesn't happen. So what is the actual downside to using GMOs? It turns out that there's no downside from a science standpoint. The only real downside that I can come up with that I think is definitely worth noting has more to do with ownership of GMO technology. And that seems to be the one thing that has become weaponized in modern society, is that those companies that have the money resources, the billions of dollars to do research and development, then put in patents to own that research and will not share that with other people. So starving countries who essentially need that technology to support their people have to pay for it. So privatizing that information is really the only real legitimate downside that I could think of for GMO development. So it is still a possible solution if one were to have like an open source version of that, you know, the way that the internet was supposed to kind of do that for information. It's taken a weird turn there, but having an open source way to do this with proper regulations so that, you know, crazy people don't do crazy things with it is where we are going to have to go. Again, with growing population and need for food, it's the only way to do it. As a show of what happens when you take it out of private hands and you put it into public hands, this is an example of where Oregon State University actually helped develop a more nutritious rice in collaboration with the Chinese government 25 years ago. So they produced a rice that actually has a gene to produce vitamin A built into it. Vitamin A deficiencies are a massive problem in certain parts of the world, and here now you can eat rice that actually gives you vitamin A. How about that? So that's pretty cool. So again, I do urge you to continue to look at this and to be really careful. You are now the scientist in your family, right? So it is incumbent upon you to really know how to weigh that evidence. And even though we might all have a certain political leaning, we also don't want to fall into tribalism, which is one of the problems. Is when we silo ourselves and we have only our friends talking to us and we are like, oh yeah, we all agree on it. There's nobody to push back on that. So you as the scientist need to be able to step back from that and really view things objectively. Okay? So this is an important example of where to do that. Okay, and we can talk more about that in lab if you're interested. But we need to move on. So livestock, also hugely important. We humans, we eat a lot of livestock in the United States and in particular, in the West actually in particular. But it's incredibly intensive, right? To grow things like cows and pigs and chickens and goats. And so very inefficient, right? Remember we talked about eating lower on the food chain? If you need 2,000 calories a day, eating 2,000 calories of grain is very different from eating 2,000 calories of cow. Eating 2,000 calories of cow requires 20,000 calories of grain because of the loss of conversion, right? The 10% rule. So just in terms of the conversion there, it's even higher for things like cows. It's less efficient. It requires 16 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of meat. Think about the amount of calories in 16 grams of grain versus 1 kilogram of meat. You lose as you eat higher on the food chain. So it's incredibly energy intensive, and again, the way that industrial agriculture or industrial food production works for livestock, trust me, if you worked a day in one of these farms where cows are being raised, you would be a vegetarian the next day. And again, the more we distance ourselves, the harder it is to eat ethically. And that's one of the important things for you, is to begin to eat more ethically and to require that of people around you. So as I mentioned before, even if you're not willing to become a vegetarian, which is totally fine, I understand that, for cultural reasons or whatever, just reducing the amount of meat that you eat makes a difference. Or turning meat into a condiment instead of a main course. You know, just using it to flavor your food instead of being the thing that you eat. All of those steps and encouraging those around you to do the same, it actually helps a great deal. So these are all of the side effects, everything from crowding effects, taking a ranging, herding animal and forcing them to live in concentrations that are thousands of times greater than what would exist in nature. And then feeding them food that they didn't evolve to eat, corn for example. Nobody evolves to eat corn like that. They're eating grasses, and nutritionally, grasses are very different from corn. Okay, so increased disease risk due to the crowding. Antibiotics are now a necessity in these animals because they are just going to get sick if you leave them in a situation like that unattended. So if you start pumping them full of antibiotics as a prophylactic, well, you're essentially inviting disease resistance in the future. And again, more on that, we can talk at length, but this is a nice book if you're looking for something fun to read over winter break. Animal Factory. We did talk about fish already, and this is the Tsukiji Fish Market, the biggest fish market in the world. It's in Japan. And, we need protein, obviously, in our diet, but using the ocean in a smart way to help alleviate that need is going to be necessary in the future, too. Fish farming is a good thing in principle if it's done well. If it's not done well, then it's horrible for the environment, as we've talked about before. Also, these are bluefin tuna. They are not going to feed hungry people hungry poor people in the world. Bluefin tuna is a designer food that is being essentially produced to feed rich people who want to eat in high-end sushi restaurants around the world. So that's the reality of things. This is a fish that could reproduce itself and make more of itself. But the consumption rate vastly outstrips the replenishment rate. And when that happens, you've taken an animal that was renewable and you've turned it into a non-renewable resource at that point. And we never got a chance to see the movie End of the Line. I'm going to see if we can watch that next week. There's time for us to do back-to-back documentaries. That documentary essentially shows what happens when a market is in charge of essentially dictating the demands for a wild species that is finite. The North Atlantic and the Mediterranean bluefin tuna stocks are essentially on the verge of extinction because literally we've eaten them all. So that's unfortunate. Okay, so, and I should say that the situation is improving, but we as a society need to remain vigilant so that we don't completely destroy ourselves. All right, so now that I put you all in a good mood, a couple of laughs, that's good.
Professor,
Yeah.
I have a question. Like, the press actually, like, not related to American, but how do you think about the fake press?
Fake. Oh, yes, fake grass. Yes. Okay, so that is something that is it's still trending. Not quite as much today as it was maybe 5 years ago, but replacing grass with artificial grass. Obviously, we've been using AstroTurf since the 1980s. You guys know what AstroTurf is? It's like fake. It's like plastic grass. So they came up with that in the Houston Astros, the baseball team. So their grass was actually fake, and they referred to it as AstroTurf. That's where we get the term from. So we've done more in the last 25 years or so to create that. The problem is that artificial grass is still made of plastic. And we're going to cover the plastic issue after this lecture. It's really bad. And so it turns out that if you have a patch of grass, we're trying not to grow Bermuda grass in our front yards, but if you were to put a thermometer in your Bermuda grass, the temperatures are a fraction of what it is if you put your thermometer in fake grass. It just retains the heat because it's a petroleum product. So some people, in small quantities, in certain applications, maybe it makes sense, but I would not go to that as your first option. I would look to California natives instead. That's a much more friendly solution for all accounts. And I think they're de-emphasizing it a little bit now too, though. But that's good. Yeah, it doesn't require any water, and people. But you know what I've noticed? Maybe you've noticed it. The high schools have been using this now for the last 15 years in their infields for their football fields and their soccer fields. We have it here at SAC over at our soccer field. Is all fake grass. Middle of the summer, when you have a track meet, guess what? They are literally turning on the sprinklers to cool down the fake grass. It is too hot to touch. Didn't save any water. And they didn't realize it because they didn't know it was going to get so hot. Okay. I've got 10 minutes here. I'm going to give a little bit of lecture also in lab just to make up for that. But I think that it was important to really take the time to cover the last lecture. Okay, let's move on to happier news. Okay, human-caused global warming. This lecture has some parts to it, and yes, we will definitely cover the controversy around it, but because this is a science class, we're going to first focus on the science of it. So the first part of this lecture is really all going to be about the greenhouse effect and what that is, how it ultimately contributes to global climate, and we're going to take a step back to review the carbon cycle a bit so that we can connect these two things, the greenhouse effect from the carbon cycle. And then we're going to talk about how it is that humans have intervened in the carbon cycle, causing an increase in heat retention on planet Earth. This is the part of it right here that's going to be the transition, is looking at the scientific literature a little bit on our carbon budget on the planet, and how it is that we measure that through something called the Keeling curve. And then this is the controversial stuff. We'll talk about why there's a controversy. We will, like we did for evolution and Darwin and all of that, demonstrate that there actually is no scientific controversy here. It is all based on politics and social cues that create the controversy. We'll talk about current and future impacts, and then we'll end it with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what a timely time to be having this lecture. Just a week ago, we had the COP27 conference, and the COP actually stands for the Conference of the Parties, and this was the 27th meeting. So Conference of the Parties is a UN international meeting for climate change, essentially setting goals for climate change action. So President Biden was there, and he gave a pretty impactful speech, rich with politics. Of course, this is the UN, so when you have country delegations, they are going to have politics infused in this, for sure. This is actually a quote from Joe Biden from earlier in the year. This is from July, where he notes, "As president, I have a responsibility to act with urgency and resolve when our nation faces clear and present danger." Clear and present danger. And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger. Now, this is rhetoric that has been increasing in the last decade. It basically skipped an administration, but prior to that, we had Barack Obama, who was the first US president to mention climate change in his inaugural speech. So that was kind of interesting. And here, Joe Biden, who was the vice president in all of that, was definitely on top of what was going on around the world regarding this with the Paris Climate Agreement and all of which maybe you've heard of. So now he's president, and he's picked up the mantle again. We're going to talk a bit about that at the end of the lecture. For now, though, we're gonna focus on the science here. Okay? We have this phenomenon on planet Earth that stems from the fact that we here on Earth have an atmosphere. Thank goodness we have an atmosphere. It's made up of gases. It's a mixture of gases. We've talked about this in a little bit, but the primary gas that is in our air that we breathe is actually nitrogen. It's a gas that is not metabolized by us. We don't use it for anything. We still need nitrogen, but we get it by other means. And there are nitrogen fixers in the world that actually do take it out of the atmosphere and turn it into nitrogen that we can then use. But we don't do that. That's something that is refined by certain organisms. So that's nitrogen. Oxygen is the next most concentrated gas. That's the part that we metabolize. Makes up essentially 20% of the atmosphere, and and nitrogen's about 78%. So 78 and a little bit. So the remaining little less than 2% of the gases in our atmosphere are made up of all these other gases, which include methane and carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and all of the other compounds that are gaseous including water vapor. Water vapor is also one of the gases that's up there. So this mixture essentially is bathing or blanketing our planet. And the concentrations have changed over the billions of years that Earth has existed. 4.5 billion years Earth has existed. In that time, the makeup of our atmosphere, in the formation of our atmosphere, there have been times when there's been more methane, when there's a lot less oxygen. There's been other times when there's way more oxygen. And obviously that's going to change the retention of heat on the planet. So every second of every day, we are essentially being bombarded by sunlight energy in the form of all forms of radiation that come to us from the sun. Just huge amounts of radiation are coming to us. And that is essentially hitting our atmosphere first. Okay, so it hits the atmosphere here. Atmosphere is made up of all these molecules, and all those photons coming in are hitting the molecules as it's coming in and causing those molecules to resonate. They essentially vibrate. And sunlight energy in particular, when it comes in, it's usually coming in at super high energy, right? That's the stuff that plants use for photosynthesis. But it hits the surface of the planet, and then it actually bounces off and reflects and comes out at lower energy, right? We talked about that when we talked about energy utilization on the planet. So it's this energy that comes in and hits and then goes back out. Two things are happening to it. Either some of it gets completely reflected out and it just leaves. And we know that because if you're on a spaceship in outer space and you're looking at the sun, at planet Earth, it's glowing, right? It's reflecting light back out to us, coming from the sun. So some of it definitely goes out. It's the reason we see the moon, right? Same thing's happening on the moon. But others is now leaving at a much lower energy state. And as it's leaving, it's hitting those molecules again, all those air molecules, all the various things in the air, and it's causing them to resonate and retain that heat, or retain that energy in the form of heat. So this retention is essentially what the greenhouse effect is. It is our atmosphere essentially acting like a blanket. You have probably experienced this yourself if you've ever waited for someone in the car while they ran into the store for 10 minutes and the windows were up in the car and the car is off, and 2 minutes later it starts to get pretty warm. 10 minutes later you're like, oh my God, I gotta roll the windows down. So the glass is allowing sunlight to come in, but then it bounces off all of the surfaces and it gets retained in the form of heat. That is essentially what is going on here. Were it not for our atmosphere, we would be more like Mars. And there's signs that Mars used to have an atmosphere like ours, but it doesn't now. And so if that were the case, given how much water we have on our planet, if we didn't have an atmosphere, we would be a spinning ball of ice through outer space. It's just what would happen. So the greenhouse effect is actually a good thing in principle because it retains enough heat so that water can remain in all three states, in gaseous state, in liquid state, and in solid state and evenly kind of distributed throughout the planet. That's amazing that we have a planet that can do that because of our atmosphere. So it's this retention of infrared heat in particular that would normally get reflected out that essentially is keeping our planet warm. And if you look at the actual molecules that are doing that retention on infrared radiation that's going out, it's two in particular that are in the atmosphere: carbon dioxide and water. Again, those are not in high concentration, but they are in concentration enough that they resonate when infrared radiation is being reflected back out, and it retains it in the form of heat. Other gases do this too. Methane does this, etc. But methane is in very low concentrations naturally in the atmosphere. Industrial usage is increasing it, but we'll talk about that later. So this tends to be up in what's referred to as the troposphere, and the troposphere is the part of the atmosphere that is closest to the ground. It's what we're essentially breathing. Okay? So again, just to put that into perspective, the atmosphere is like a greenhouse. A greenhouse where it's just glass, so it allows the light in, but it keeps the heat from leaving. So with CO2, it keeps it at a certain temperature, but and we know, as you learned in the CO2 or in the carbon cycle, that the carbon in the atmosphere is one of the places where carbon naturally exists. And so it makes sense that if you increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, you're going to increase the atmosphere's ability to hold onto that energy in the form of heat. So that's essentially what's going on here. And I'm going to pick it up here after or during lab before we start with our entomology stuff. But it's important to think about this in terms of a carbon budget problem. It's a carbon budget problem. And yeah, we'll just leave it there for now.